This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider Video Interview, I will be talking with three essayists, Andrew Grossman, Norman Ball, and Jeremy Collins, and we'll be talking about their work specifically, and we'll also talk about the art of essay writing and how they write essays and how it's different from other sorts of writing like fiction or poetry, and we'll do that in just a moment. All right. I want to introduce the three panelists that I have, all essayists, all of them that I've met online in one form or another. And I guess we can go by alphabetically. So let me start with Norman Ball. Norman, I had met maybe about a decade or so ago online. I forget whether I had met him at a website or whatnot, but I know he has submitted a few pieces, and I posted some of his pieces on Cosmoetica. So, Norman, if you could tell the viewers a little bit about yourself in general in writing, and also then specifically about your views on the writing or the art of essay writing.
Well, thanks for having me, Dan. I've been writing essays, in a determined manner probably for, 15 years. I came out of a professional background. I've got an MBA in finance. I still do IT consulting and program management. And I did a lot of professional writing. And often I was the guy that, ended up writing reports in a business context. Well, that sort of whetted my appetite for writing, and I got more into literary venues and avenues. And of late, I've been writing not so much literary. Well, I like the lyric essay. I'm a big booster of the lyric essay form. I've been doing a lot of geopolitical, economic, kind of multidisciplinary type essays. I'm a big fan of the essay. I like some of the older guys, Gay Talese, John Didion. That's where I was originally inspired. Those sorts of folks. I think the essay I think there's a place for the essay still. I think it's under siege. I think we're in an immediacy sort of culture, and we're fighting uphill. But I think it's a worthwhile struggle.
When you say under siege, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think attention spans have been truncated. I think we're in an ADHD multitasking culture, and I think essays are a little more ruminative, and they demand of the reader more of his or her time, and time is precious and rare and valuable. So that's sort of the tension right now, I think, in the essay form.
Yeah. So you think sort of the lowest common denominator, it's not a form conducive to that?
Well, I think if you look at the problems on the planet, I think they do require rumination. I think there needs to be a group of folks that do their best to gather up these problems and with all due respect to prevailing attention spans, we have an obligation to combine these issues in a coherent manner. So although people are in a hurry, problems are becoming more intractable. Maybe there's a relationship there. I don't know.
Okay. Jeremy Collins, I was originally had asked you to be on an earlier show that I did a few weeks back on sports writing, and I had to move you to this show up. But I found on a sports writing website, SB Nation. You had done an interesting piece on the pitcher Greg Maddux called 13 Ways of Looking at Greg Maddux, which is a play off of a famous Wallace Stevens poem. And you also have your own website, and I believe you might be the only one of the three that actually teaches. Do you teach essay writing as well? If you want to introduce yourself.
We could use the verb teach. I try to model enthusiasm for the essay here in Arvada, Colorado, and it's an interesting situation. Norman was mentioning geopolitical realities and where nonfiction collides with the world. I teach at an early college. It is partnered with the University of Colorado at Denver, and we teach college courses to 11th and 12th graders. Many of these students are first generation ELL students. So it's interesting. There's a place for nonfiction in the world of teenagers, especially that voice of the essay, and then the words of so many of our students. There's a sort of a hunger for authenticity or keeping it real. So we get to talk about ways in which nonfiction and truth and reality sort of commingle. Before that, I did sort of the adjunct tour indentured servitude for a number of years at the University of Tennessee and the University of Louisville, and so I have about 7 years of teaching at the collegiate level as well.
So Norm had mentioned that he has written, and I know he's written for foreign policy magazines and whatnot. Have you done mostly people-based pieces, or do you do investigative journalism as well, and then work them into your essay? Or when you write an essay, is it just whatever is at hand, or do you also do essays that you write and then send around, or are you a for hire writer mostly?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be able to do some more investigative pieces that sort of immerse deep reporting and questions and research. But most of the time, it's material on hand. Working at a at-risk Title I charter school, it's a sort of a total investment. So most of the things that I work on, trying to think of something that's collided with maybe sort of larger political issues. A couple years ago, I wrote an essay called Basic Composition, which looked at working with soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq who were mustering into my class, basic composition courses. And I was having them write essays and based off their experiences and sort of my naive assumption that 18 and 19-year-olds pretty much have the same thing that they want to write about, the death of their grandmother, the death of a goldfish. But these students were writing about things like the Battle of the Second Fallujah and watching a buddy bleed out and coming back and not being able to grapple with that. So my inadequacy and sort of trying to be totally ill-prepared to sort of react to the things on the page prompted that essay. So there's things at hand, and I think being just curious about the world in general helps.
Well, let me turn to Andrew Grossman, the third of our essayists on this show. Now, Andrew, I was pointed to by Norman Ball, and I've read a handful of his essays on the Pop Matters website, which is, I guess, what it says, a pop cultural weblog. Do you write mostly about pop culture, Andrew, in your essays, or do you do investigative journalism, for Salon or one of the political websites?
Well, just about everything I've written is criticism of some form or another: film, music, literary criticism, sometimes cultural criticism. The stuff I've written on Pop Matters is actually a bit more popular than what I often write. I had written for almost 15 years for another online journal, Bright Lights Film Journal, and some of that stuff is fairly esoteric. I also come from kind of an academic background. I taught briefly expository and creative writing. This was at Rutgers University in New Jersey. That didn't last very long. I tried some other things. I worked in publishing for a little while. I tried filmmaking for a little while. That didn't work out so great either, because it's really a madman's preoccupation. But most of my interests are intellectual. I never imagined that I would have a large audience writing about some obscure foreign films or something like that. Norman and I were talking about this earlier. I think the sticking point for me is that if your writing doesn't fit into a particular category, it's very difficult to present or market. So I don't really write conventional scholarly essays or standard academic essays. So, for example, what I write wouldn't be published in some academic journal because it's not quite academic enough. On the other hand, it's not really journalism because it's probably a bit too verbose or intellectual to be considered journalism. So it kind of floats in this in-between area, and if I can get it out there in any way, well, it's usually appreciated. But
critical essay, and I think Norm had mentioned lyrical essay, and there are things sort of like the hidden personal essay. Lauren Isley, who was a science writer, was sort of one of the people who brought that to the fore. You have the sort of blatantly political kind of essays that someone like James Baldwin wrote. Let me sort of track back with all three of you and ask what were the essayists that you read, and what type of essays were you drawn to, if anything? Or was it the subject matter? If there was well written personal essay, memoiristic essay, or are you drawn to a certain type of the form, or is it whatever interests you?
It was usually, I mean, when I was young, when I was in my late teens or early 20s, I was usually drawn to philosophical essays. Say, you mentioned Voltaire, Nietzsche, the late Nietzsche of Ecce Homo and his kind of crazy period. That's sort of what, attracts me. I always think about the word essay in its original meaning, right, from the French, which means to attempt, especially to attempt in a kind of ambitious or heroic way. But the fact that you're starting with the idea of an attempt already has the implicit and built-in idea that you probably won't succeed. It's just an attempt. But the attempt is enough. And I think that, that's probably what separates the essay as a form from poetry, which I tried poetry, I was never very good at it. But if poetry attempts at some kind of crystallized and perfected meaning, the essay is usually very messy, it can be digressive, unfinished, rough around the edges. And I think that's the sort of, I think I'm kind of attracted to that messiness. And again, what we're talking about in personal essay. Academic essays are sort of another can of worms. Or
how about you, Jeremy?
Specifically, Dan, in terms of model essays or influences?
No? How about you, Norm?
Well, it's funny, Andrew, I'm a fan of Andrew's writing, and he mentions Nietzsche. I like in a lot of Andrew's sentence structure to Nietzsche. I wish I knew German. I only read Nietzsche in English, of course, but the sentences are almost attempting to be paragraphs, and they're not linear. It's almost like a branch with little sub-branches where there's little cul-de-sacs, and a good Nietzsche sentence is just a fascinating construction. And Andrew has that similar. He sweats over his sentences, and you can see that. I like craftsmanship in writing. I don't mind taking the long road home in writing. I think there's too much journalistic, clipped off, blogosphere stuff. I like writing for its own sake, and that's not very fashionable, I think. I like speculative essays which are grounded in real things. I'm not a big memoirist. My belly button isn't out, yours is a nitty, okay? And we all have one. I mean, memoiristic essays are so overdone, and I often feel they're done because a lot of people don't have much more that interests them than themselves. I mean, you find you find that in the poetry world. I write a bit of poetry, and that sort of hyper self-absorption, I don't like that in an essay.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up actual structure in writing, because I think a lot of times, whether it's poetry or it's prose fiction or whatnot, and I think one of the problems with most published writing today is that people don't pay attention to the skills. So since you brought it up, I'm sure you could name me like one or two of the essayists that you've read the most, and say, can you name me, let's say, two essayists that have totally different approaches in the essay writing form, but are both excellent, and how they structure things differently, Norm?
Well, let me throw a couple of current names out. I like Sarah Vowell. I think she's got a great droll, and she's a great speaker too. I like her oral essays, her radio essays. She's great with the language. She makes nice droll sentences and creates interesting essays. And she's a history buff, and I am too. So I enjoy that. And I'm thinking Dinky Moore on probably in the other side of he's much more efficiency driven and short sentences, that more of that journalistic, but he's very straightforward. So those are probably two different poles in my mind.
And have you patterned your writing after anyone in particular, an essayist in particular, or do you sort of just take a smorgasbord of what works at the moment?
I don't. Yeah, that's a good question, Dan. What I strive to do is, and part of the reason I write poetry, I don't self-identify as a poet by any stretch, but I find that my poetry is an exercise, and it expresses itself best in my prose, kind of indirectly, because I like, again, the lyric essay where you're a certain nonlinearity. You're moving away from the exposition, the declarative sentences. You're making some strange, nonlinear, imagistic sort of narratives that are not journalistic and not reportage, and yet you're talking about current events. I think that's fascinating. Getting underneath the blogosphere and the millions of recountings of which politician is ahead by what percentage. You can find that in a million different venues, but if you can kind of excavate that and get underneath with some nonlinearity, I think you create some epiphanies. That's what I like to do, or try to do.
Okay, Jeremy, since I had mentioned your earlier mentioned your Greg Maddox essay, which takes its title from a famous Wallace Stevens poem, can I assume that you have read poetry, and does poetry in any way, or the more heightened structure and the more heightened emotional impact of words in poetry, has that had any influence on your essay writing outside of outside of the Maddox one as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of us as writers, on some level, are failed poets, are poets trying to grapple with words. Having read Stevens, it's heartening to hear Nietzsche's name mentioned as much as it is already this morning. I came to Stevens through Nietzsche, and it's interesting too, like this question of navel gazing in the memoir, and maybe just to push a little bit on that. If you look at a work earlier in Nietzsche's Ecce Homo or Thus Spake Zarathustra, there are these incredible lyrical moments, like even within sentences. And you're right, Norman, it probably sounds a lot better in the German. But I'm thinking of one in Thus Spake Zarathustra, book 2, in which he says, talking about the ideal poet or the Übermensch, free of the Nazi context, obviously, but he says, he flows, he overflows, he uses himself up. And he has these sentences that become these sort of shadows, or these sort of little moments of poetry. And I think reading Nietzsche, of course, in English, heightened my awareness, at least to sort of this kind of lyrical potential within nonfiction, and led me to Stevens through some criticism. But as a conscious model, no. Like, I'll find poetry, something from Philip Levine or something from Stevens, and just sort of tuck it away. But most of the sort of conscious models that I've used are Tobias Wolff, Mary Carr, kind of traditional memoirists, as well as the essayists like Didion and like Baldwin. So it's interesting. I mean, ultimately, on some level, these genres all blur because we are using words, and we are using the same type of thing that you would find, say, in fiction and some element in nonfiction, whether that's the lyrical essay, the investigative essay, or the personal essay.
Yeah, I know when I write poetry, and when I've critiqued others' poetry, I've always told them that, or even writing too, that you can take something, let's say in a love poem, first cliche, but if you're writing a poem about, say, a professional boxer, Sonny Liston or something, that line that's cliched in one aspect, one approach to writing, could be very revelatory and very new in another one. And well, let me go to Andrew. Have you found yourself, say, using any technique that may not have worked if, let's say, you were writing a short story and you've used that technique in an essay and it works?
That's a good question. There were times when I was younger when I tried to write poetry and short stories. I haven't written. I haven't tried to write short stories in a while. I did actually publish a narrative essay recently, which was about my own experiences as as a graduate student teaching the position from which I eventually was fired. That I can't say that I was looking at any particular memoirs, but maybe I was trying to filter some remembered style of various memoirs when I was writing that particular essay. I think you were asking the other two fellows if they consciously modeled their writing after anybody. I have to say I do, actually. I don't think that's a good thing. When I get stuck, I mean, I do open Nietzsche or the Romanian essay Emil Cioran, who is actually sometimes even better than Nietzsche. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't like using a crutch in that way. Um, Sometimes I do get stuck, though. I think I don't know, maybe that's just an emotional problem or an intellectual problem. I wish I didn't have to do that. I wish I could somehow draw upon a more abstract and better filtered sense of everything I had, excuse me, I've read throughout my life. But my brain doesn't seem to work that way. And when I get stuck, I will open something. Although I will say that I never, if I'm, let's say if I'm writing a piece of film criticism, I won't read anything about film, especially since most film criticism is just, I find it unreadable. I'll probably read something on a subject that has nothing to do with what I'm writing, just so I can get a fresh sense of how another author will structure sentences and, even very simple things, use parts of speech and so forth. But I really just want the structure and the form. The content is, I try not to pay attention to.
Yeah, I know with film criticism, like when I read like Cahiers du Cinema type film reviews, I mean, it's like, oh God, it's like, shut the fuck up with Karl Marx. It's like, I mean, just watch the movie. But I know what you're saying. Let me end this segment by asking each of you a final question for this segment, and that's, how do you think that your essays or your approach to essay writing has evolved, say, in the 10, 15, 20 years you may have been doing it? And where on a continuum do you see yourself, say, in another 10 or 15 years? So let me just start with Andrew and work backwards.
That's a good question. I think it has evolved. Sometimes I'll go back online and I'm tempted to look at other things, I've written 15 years ago. And, it's strange. Sometimes when I look at something I've written a long time ago, it seems very unfamiliar. It was this uncanny feeling. I sometimes think to myself, who actually wrote this? It wasn't me. I recognize, elements of my personality and maybe certain ways I'll write sentences, but a lot of it seems very rough. I mean, when I go back and read something, I'm now 42. If I read something that I wrote maybe when I was 28, a lot of it will seem embarrassing, rough, immature, badly judged. As I get older, I do try to make my writing much, much tighter. In some ways, I hope shorter, maybe less digressive. Even though I like digressions, I think sometimes you have to use your judgment and call it quits at a certain point.
Okay.
I hope I'm becoming more focused. When I look at some of my old writing, it's terribly unfocused. I think sometimes I might like to go back and rewrite everything I wrote, but I don't know if it's worth the time doing that.
Okay. How about you, Jeremy? Where, from 10 years ago to 10 years from now, where do you see yourself on a continuum of, where you were, where you are, and where you're going to be writing-wise?
Yeah, so I came to this venture because of the death of my best friend Jason Kinney, who's sort of he's featured in the Maddox essay. I mean, the Maddox essay is about Maddox, but it's also about Jason. And that was in 1996, his death in our accident. And go back to Nietzsche in 1878, Birth of a Tragedy. Nietzsche talks about art being the supreme task. And for me, what I wanted to do was to write a book, a memoir about Jason, and my early influences, Hemingway and Tobias Wolff. I mean, I typed out "The Sun Also Rises" into my computer. I typed out this boy's life, and when I go back and look at that unpublished material, you know, it's highly comic in all sorts of ways. It's an imitation of an imitation. So it took years to realize that, well, about my buddy Jason and his short, brief life, it's an essay that involves a baseball player. And I've written other standalone essays, but when I look sort of at the next, where my writing would like to go, it is in longer form profile pieces and potentially book-length pieces, something along the lines of sports, politics, culture, and something that can move a little bit more outside of myself.
And Norm, since you probably have the longest career of the three fellows I'm speaking to, you probably have the longest evolution. So where do you see yourself past, present, and future as an essayist?
Well, it's funny that you say career. I got to chuckle. Can I chuckle? And it reminds me what a friend once told me from my prior more intense business background. He wrote an essay of mine and he said, "Man, that's pretty good. You should have been a writer." I thought I was, but you know, if you want to call it a career, it's more vocation. But I've been writing. I've been popping up recently. Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, Foreign Policy Journal. Maybe 7 years ago, I was writing a lot of essays about poetry. I love to think about poetry. I think it's. I often joke. I like to write about poetry more than I like poetry itself. I think the process is fascinating. But I think there's so many things happening in the world in this particular calendar year. A lot of things are coming to a head in terms of global finance. You know, the Russia-China, United States, flagging American empire. That really, that's where the excitement is, and that's where you can. I feel I can contribute some insights, or at least try to. I think this is going to be a very eventful year, and particularly the back end and leading into 2016. So I almost feel like I don't know, is it a civic responsibility to maybe grow up and be a little more, looking at grown-up things and getting away from poetry. And I say that with the highest regard for the art stuff. And I want to throw out two other names if I could. You guys, Jeremy was mentioning sports. I don't know if you guys know Frank DeFord. He was a great sports essayist. And if you go back and look at his old boxing essays from the 70s, and great stuff. Also, Pepe Escobar, who writes for Asia Times quite a bit. He's a Brazilian guy. I don't know if you know him. He's got like a Hunter S. Thompson. He goes all over the world. And he writes about the Eurasian century. Fascinating guy. Nice literary references, which I think deepens the essay. I like that. I like to pull poetry in. I like to cite poets, and I like to drag poetry into the real world and put it in current events because I believe it's very relevant. I mean, I don't think it's an antique or an ornament. I think it's instructive. It deepens and broadens the examination, and that gets back to my lyric essay, my fondness for the lyric essay. In fact, if I could, I went back to the Seneca Review this morning. Every few years I go over there and I read their, it's like a manifesto of the lyric essay. Here's the quote. These poetic essays or essayistic poems give primacy to artfulness over the conveying of information. They forsake narrative line, discursive logic, and the art of persuasion in favor of idiosyncratic meditation. And that, to me, in a nutshell, is the lyric essay. It dispenses with the myth of causality and linearity, and it is a myth. Things don't happen in a linear fashion in the planet and the universe. Things are happening simultaneously. 5 things are happening at the same time, and you get some sort of historical trajectory out of the simultaneity. So I think we have to get off the causality track, the linear track, which is typically a prosaic approach. I think we really have to think poetically and imagistically. I think that enriches the discussion. We're at a lot of inflection points at this point in time, and I think we need more poetry in our examinations of what's happening on the planet today.
Okay, well, that's a good segue to end this segment, because in our next segment, I want to talk about how you guys approach an essay And I also wanted you to sort of toot your horns and maybe pick out one or two of the essays that you're most proud of and describe a little bit how you wrote them, how you approach them and whatnot. But we'll do that in our next segment. All right, we had a nice first segment. In our next segment, I want to talk a little bit more about what Norman Ball had closed the last segment on, and that's the approach to writing. Because a lot of times when I do listen to webcasts or podcasts or anything on writing, it's always about the subject matter, and it's always about, you know, I'm for this or against that. And I'm glad that Norm has a couple of times brought up the actual art of writing. So let me just sort of put out a, for instance, a sort of thing that might happen to you guys and see how you might approach that. Let's say everyone goes to, say, a high school reunion, the 10, 15, 25-year reunion. Say if you went there, you found out that, you know, a kid that you were on the softball team or the baseball team or whatnot with died. And, you know, you can call him Spunky Silverman or whatever. And this guy, maybe he died of AIDS, maybe he got hit in a car crash, died in 9/11 or whatnot. You go to this this reunion, you come back and you're thinking to yourself, now I've got to write about Spunky. You know, Jeremy seems to have already done something sort of like that with the mention of his friend. Do you do it as an essay, a short story? What determines how you're going to approach it in terms of a genre, and also in terms of how you're going to, once you decide what genre you're going to approach the death of this old classmate in, how you would do that? So maybe Andrew, if I start off with you, how would you talk about Spunky?
Actually, you know, it's interesting that you bring up this example because I've been thinking about something very similar. Occasionally, for whatever reason, I guess he was fairly influential to me. I sometimes think about my old film professor. I went to Sarah Lawrence College in New York about 20 years ago, and I was just surfing the internet, and I found out that this old film professor, his name was Gilberto Perez, he died just a couple of months ago. And there were certain times when I actually tried to reconnect with him. He never responded to me. He probably forgot who I was.
Yeah.
But he remained very much in my thoughts. Even if I write a piece of film criticism, I'll go back in my mind 20 years to his film class, and I still remember some of the stuff we talked about. So it actually occurred to me that I might write something about him, and the question that I was posing to myself was exactly the one you posed. Of what form should it take? Is it a memoir? Is it more of a critical essay? Should it deal with his ideas? Should it deal with him as a human being? I don't have the answer yet. It's still rough, and the way I usually write things is very fragmentary. I probably hate writing things in any particular order. I just have lots of little floating fragments, and then I sit with them for a few months, and then I try to see how they fit together, and hopefully they'll take some kind of shape. You know, probably, if possible, maybe the best thing to do is interweave different styles, have them somehow dialectically come together, or at least dialectically clash. And it doesn't have to be merged or melded perfectly together. Sometimes I just like to let different forms or styles sit together in opposition, and then the reader can somehow deal with the opposition. I guess that's the kind of messy part of the writing that I like, that it doesn't have to crystallize.
Yeah, I know. I had a very similar thing last year. I had found out that a woman that I'd known, who was a fairly well-known New Eurekan poet, her name was Maggie Estep, had died last year at the age of 50 suddenly. And it was about 6 months afterwards that you know, you look on Facebook or Google when you have some time and you're tired and you look up old classmates or workmates. And it was very easy to write about her because when I looked at all the sort of bullshit hagiographies that a lot of these people who claim to have known her had written about her, they didn't really know her. They were just regurgitating the same thing. And I hadn't known her for 25 years. So my approach was basically, actually talk about this woman. I mean, she had a lot of problems that contributed to her death in personal choices, but no one talked about it. So that's one of the reasons that I guess I just psychologically was thinking about that. But Jeremy, since you had mentioned your friend in the Maddox essay, you may have covered this, but what if you have another example, or if you want to use the friend from the Maddox story, how did you decide particularly to approach it? You said you were thinking it was a book, and then you shrunk it down to an essay. What was your approach in terms of bringing in Maddox? Say, did he give you sort of a wall to bounce ideas off of and contrast the friend with?
Yeah. I'll go back a little bit, and so Jason, he died in 1996. And I started writing shortly thereafter on the same sort of question of teacher. I mean, I had a teacher named Dr. Stephen Harvey, who's an essayist and a writer, and he had us, pumping out personal essays when we were at this small little 2-year school in the mountains of Northeast Georgia, and it was an incredible exposure. And he actually called to the hospital.
Just so people know, it looks like we had some issues with Norman Ball's feed, so hopefully he'll pop back in a few minutes. But Jeremy, if you want to continue with your tale.
Yeah, maybe something that might help in terms of a couple of things we're talking about with influences and teachers and also subject matter and approaches. For me, trying to write a book-length draft that kind of held together about the story of that friendship, it went through a couple of different realizations and shopped it to agents and entered different contests, and it never landed. The thing that helped me was in 2006, 2007, writing a personal essay that talked about that writing process and reference to my relationship to the movie, the original Rocky, done in 1976. It's something that I'd grown up with. That story of how Stallone made it was something that I always identified with in terms of the artistic process. And that allowed me to sort of step outside of just the story of Jason and his death and talk about art and talk about writing and talk about the creative process and while talking about Jason at the same time. So a lot of times in my work, what's successful for me in terms of just thinking about an approach is self in the world and having something that's firmly rooted in some curiosity of someone else, some other life beyond your own story, and these different points of intersection. So you take, Spunky Silverman, who might have died in 9/11. We're going to talk about Spunky, but we're also going to talk about those 21 hijackers, and we're going to go back and trace their lives. So we're going to do something interesting with that, and talk about geopolitical realities as well as Spunky's 7th grade experience. The world's wide open.
Okay. Let me just take a pause here, and I'll try and get Norman Ball back. So we'll do that in a moment. I apologize. For the remainder of this segment, though, with Jeremy and Andrew, let me start with Andrew, and let's talk about, as I said, essays that you've already written, not what you would write, but is there an essay or so, and you said you've written mostly critical essays, have you gotten any blowback or brushback if you've written on, a particular topic that was someone might have thought was offensive or this or that? I know I saw one on Magnus Hirschfeld, the old sexual guru. Did that garner anything?
No, I don't know. There was one essay. This was about 10 years ago. I had the chance to write an essay about and interview Otto Muehl, who was a very controversial Austrian performance artist in the 1960s and 70s. He wrote various manifestos, and he took part in various scandalous acts of performance art in Austria. And in the 1970s, he kind of left the art world and opened his own commune, which was based on the principles of Wilhelm Reich. So I didn't know anything about this,
Reich
but
was the
I
guy.
kind of
Reich was the guy who made orgone, right? Was
yes, exactly, yeah.
yeah.
So I didn't really know much about this guy Otto Mule.
Yeah.
I had heard about him. He's kind of a notorious figure. He's dead now. He died a few years ago, but he was kind of a notorious figure in the art world. I had only read about him. Um, so I actually started to correspond with him, and he wrote back, and over a period of months, we put together, I guess you'd call it an essay. It was technically it's in the form of an interview, but it's basically an essay. It just happens to be in the shape of an interview, going back and forth. He was actually put in jail for 8 years. It was claimed that he was abusing or raping people in his commune, something that he vehemently denied. He claimed that there were government plots against him to discredit him and his artistic and communistic theories. I really had no, I had no idea whether or not he was guilty or innocent. Um, I mean, it's quite interesting as an artist. He's also a painter. He has his own galleries in Austria. Um, Very interestingly, you asked if anything was controversial. Actually, I got a few, after this was published, I got a few notes. I got a letter from somebody who claims that he was abused in this commune, and he claims that, I was, participating in this abuse, that I was enabling. There's Norman.
Welcome back, Norm.
Hey, sorry, guys.
And if we can, Andrew's just in the middle of the
Yeah.
story, so.
Okay.
So this person was claiming that I was very naive for even having done this interview and given him a platform and so forth. But interestingly enough, the essay or the interview was published in English a couple times, and it was republished in German. And the final time it was published in German, I guess it was in 2008, it was actually published in a monograph by the Austrian Parliament, the same parliament that had sentenced him to prison. So I don't know if that's some sort of indication, but
Yeah, I had a similar experience myself. There was a film that was a documentary about 12 or so years ago called "Capturing the Freedmans" about this this family that was accused of, father and son accused of molesting people, and I had gotten into a correspondence with the son for a little bit. And I wanted to actually do an interview with him, but he didn't. He was also quite paranoid too. He had a lot of these, and he had actually spent some time in jail. So I guess his paranoia was justified to a degree. But I know what you're talking about. Before I get to Jeremy, since Norm, we had lost you there. I wanted to ask you. Let's see. When we're starting here. Well, I guess we didn't. I didn't really miss much. No. Well, let's go to you then before I hit to Jeremy. I was asking them about the most notable essays, maybe, or the essays of yours that garnered the most renown or acclaim and whatnot, and why it did so, and how you wrote it. So, Norm, if you want to.
Oh boy. I write political satire from time to time, and I find satire is just it's just powerful in terms of response. If you can make people laugh, they almost have this sort of they have a need to communicate the fact, hey, you made me laugh. Maybe it's you penetrated my permanent cynicism and reminded me I could laugh. I don't know what it is, but I get a lot more feedback from satire. I forget where it appeared. I wrote a satire piece on John McCain, and I do graphics too. I had him. It was an Al Qaeda satire, and it rippled all across the planet. I mean, I think it was in Global Research, and it was popping up on Iranian blogs, and probably got me on an ISIS watch list, or probably on both sides, But that was one. I've had a couple of poetry essays that kind of do the rounds, and I'm always surprised at the essays that sort of catch fire. have a life and bounce around. I wrote an essay that compared ISIS. If you look at the ISIS flag, the black and white flag, it's and I'm very Jungian too. I'm into Jungian stuff, and I saw so many similarities between the ISIS flag and the Ebola virus. They look identical. The Arabic, I forget the type of Arabic it is. It's a particular script. But I wrote an essay that kind of talked about it in a Jungian sense, that these are two manifestations that have very eerie simultaneity. And that still gets about 100 hits a day, and I don't know from where. And maybe I should worry about that. So, impact. Satire is very impactful. I mean, you can be as clever and as insightful as you want. And if you can make people laugh, it's a very powerful it's in your arsenal as a writer. A little bit of turn of phrase and humor is very potent.
Yeah, I know what you mean about not people. You're wondering why something catches fire. I know some about my maybe top 5 essays that I got the most hits on my website. One of some of them I understand. Like I did a long piece on conspiracies, JFK and UFOs. Well, that's gonna have a cult value. Then I had an interview some years ago with a fellow who wrote Dark City, and he also wrote The Limey, Lem Dobbs, and that's like that's I think of any creative writing page I have has the most hits, and it's just an interview with him. Now it's a 60,000 word interview that's probably 50,000 of his words, but it's like I didn't know Lem Dobbs had that many fans. I mean, he's a good screenwriter, but you don't know. But before I hit to Jeremy, the question that I had asked about approach before you had some technical difficulties, if with an essay, if you were writing, say, about a personal friend or a classmate who had died, what approaches, what filters into you? What do you filter out? How do you decide to, on an approach? Is it do you have a normal way or fix on things, or is it just whatever comes in that moment, in that month, with that subject?
Well, it's as Andrew said, Dan. It's funny you bring this up. I mean, it's timely for me as well. I lost a very close friend last week.
I'm sorry.
Who, and interestingly, I had this internet world we live in. I'd never met him face to face, but we corresponded almost on a daily basis for the better part of a decade. Very nice, very, very nice man who lived in Nebraska and was just a gifted reader of poetry. He would send me poems. We talked a lot, and I don't think there was an essay I wrote that doesn't have some of his imprimatur in varying degrees over the last 7 or 8 years. So I'm sort of still grappling with his very sudden departure. He was like 52. Certainly not an old man by any stretch. And I did catch Andrew before I was unceremoniously dumped off the internet there just a few minutes ago. I think I like the mosaic, the ungelled personal aspects, personality aspects, and maybe a larger context, some sort of mosaic or loosely associate a series of memories that are reflective of him as a person and his character. I wrote an extended piece for my dad, which is out there. My father passed away about 5 years ago, and I think it got me thinking, one of the primordial responsibilities of writers, in my opinion, if you were to ask me why writing originated, and I don't know if these other guys have this same feeling, but when someone close to you dies, a writer has almost a primordial sense that he has to commemorate that person. He has a responsibility or an obligation to enlarge or to bring to the world's attention this person who just left us. It's our obligation or duty. And it made me think that it's almost, maybe it's the original rationale for the writing vocation. I wonder if somebody has an opinion on that. Jeremy, you mentioned your friend, your close friend.
Yeah, Norman, it's sorry for your loss as well. And it's interesting just saying that it's a cliche, and you realize like how much we deal in cliche, and that the deal in cliche might be the thread of civilization in some ways, but tracing that thread back to that ancient charge of the writer. I mean, there we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh. I love the conclusion, that epilogue that's tagged on at the end. That Gilgamesh came back to Uruk and carved the whole story out on stone. You know, thinking about writing as this very physical, tactile thing. For me too, trying to read the Iliad. And Achilles' loss of Patroclus in Book 28 of the Iliad. It's an ancient charge, and like you said, primordial, and I don't think it goes away. It doesn't go away because the losses don't go away. The losses just keep mounting. The longer we keep going. So I think that charge and responsibility is definitely there.
And let's face it, if we as writers don't do it, then who is? It does fall to us to use our vocation to obviously preserve the past, to commemorate and memorialize, but somehow impart a reality that the world may have missed. You know, it's not a particularly public figure. I felt that on 2 or 3 occasions with somebody who's passed away that was close to me. I felt almost a writerly obligation that transcends any other subject matter. It's almost like the rest of what we write about, in a strange way, is like marking time until such time as our vocation is truly called upon to record and commemorate the passing of a human being.
Yeah, it's interesting because next week I'm actually going to be interviewing the wife of a man I never met, a fellow named George Dickerson, an actor. He was in Hill Street Blues. He did a few David Lynch films, and about a dozen years or so ago, he had contacted me out of the blue regarding poetry and my website, and I talked to him maybe 2 or 3 times a year for about 90 minutes, and he died earlier this January, and so he's got a screenplay that's possibly in development, a screenplay they wrote of his experience in the 1970s Lebanon War, and so I'm going to be interviewing his friends and family over the course of a year or so. I don't know what I'm going to do with the stuff, but just so that there's sort of an archive of it. But Jeremy, let me get back to you regarding your most notable or best essays. If we go beside or past the Maddox one, is there another essay of yours that you've written that you would consider or has gotten a number of attention, be it political or whatnot? And how did you approach that essay, and if in any difference from, say, the Maddox essay?
Yeah, something that Norman said earlier about satire. I wrote an essay in 2010 called "When We Were Young and Confederate," and it took this troubling memory of something that happened to me in my youth, in which I was mugged at gunpoint at the age of 15 after basketball practice for my Air Jordans by 2 African American teenagers. And the resulting cascading events of that was I became a devotee of Rush Limbaugh's radio show, and this kind of like riding the wave of this type of white resentment in the mid-1990s, early 1990s. And I was also involved in some Civil War reenacting. You can imagine how popular that sort of social life was in high school. But I was sort of fascinated by this type of Southern strategy in the South in terms of post-Civil Rights Act, Southern resentment, and the rise of the Republican South, and my place in it, and how I've been a part of that in the suburbs of Metro Atlanta without really knowing it all the time. And this was the second year into President Obama's administration, and there was a lot of sort of race things in the air. Going back to that now in 2015, the approach I took in that essay was trying to be funny and serious and somewhat sad, talking about the Civil War memory and how that's sort of defined who we are and who we're not. And it's it did okay. It got some attention, but it's something that I realize now that it's going to be with us as long as our American Republic is, this question of race and humanity, of how we relate to each other.
And I actually once ended up at a Ku Klux Klan meeting in Long Island when I was about 9. I was in the Cub Scouts, and a friend of mine whose father I didn't know was the Long Island Klan leader had invited me out to a picnic. I get out there with another friend of mine. I'm thinking we're going to play volleyball, see some girls with their tits bouncing, and I see these people in white robes. I'm like, what the hell is this?
Yeah, the veritable Long Island Ku Klux Klan. That enclave must be thriving these days. Huh?
Yeah, but anyway, let's end this segment. Let me just ask a question though about essay writing and whatnot. And I don't know if any of you, Norm, I know probably has a sort of a student of the essays, the art form. Do you think that you were talking about writing and commemorating someone, but do you think that that's where the impulse to write about true events came from, not fictionalizing them, to memorialize the dead? Or do you think there was some other impulse? I mean, do you think that some guy in Egypt really wanted to shove it up Ramses' ass and wrote some political screed, some op-ed, and put it around on the papyrus and whatnot? Where do each of you think, if you've even looked at the issue, where do you think that the impulse to write about reality in this sort of, I guess you would call it more journalistic way comes from? How about you, Andrew?
Well, I think I also have the sort of impulse to write satire and political stuff. You mentioned that essay about Magnus Hirschfeld, which was sort of started as a book review, but I think has some satirical elements in it, especially about where this country stands with regard to its Puritan past and just how it views sex in general. Usually, I think I was reading an essay by Philip Lopate the other day, and he was saying that in general, essayists, or at least personal essayists, they have an obligation to interrogate their own ignorance. And I think that's probably a pretty good way to put it. Usually, if I'm writing something, I like to start from a position of ignorance and see how far my ignorance can actually be stretched. I think, a lot of times I read, well, let's say skim, not read. I'll try to skim, let's say, an academic essay, which is kind of the opposite. It's very narrow in its scope, but the author takes a position of great knowledge, that he knows everything within a narrow scope. A personal essay, I think, works in the opposite way. The scope is much broader, but you begin with ignorance, not with the presumption of knowledge. And then, to go back to that original meaning of essay as a trial, right? You sort of put your own ignorance through a trial, and exposing your ignorance to knowledge, you kind of see where you end up. I sometimes find that I wind up in the same place, which is probably not very good. I think when I look at a lot of my essays, maybe they're a bit too repetitive. You asked to sort of connect this back to the question you asked earlier about writing for someone who has died. I do agree with Norman that there is some necessity in writing about people who have recently died. I don't think I can do it very well. For example, I couldn't even imagine writing anything about my parents. I think maybe that just says something about me. For that old professor, there's a little bit of distance, which makes it easier. But I often wonder how intimate I should get in a piece of writing.
Well, are you more comfortable than writing as the person looking to explore from the inside out, or rather than as the expert from the outside in? Then
I think so. I mean, I usually, take the position of Socrates, which is, I know that I know nothing. I think if I didn't, it wouldn't be worth writing. I mean, each essay should be something of an adventure, and at the starting point, you should know nothing, or at least as little as you can possibly know, and in the sense that you try to filter out outside influences and perhaps forget things that you know and strike out anew.
Okay. Norm, you seem ready to go.
Yeah, I'm chomping at the bit here, Dan.
Okay.
I feel dead people are no longer here, and that's maybe self-evident, but they're slipping away, and they can't speak up for themselves. And they're receding even from the memories of their loved ones and their inner close circles. And if we don't articulate for them, speak on their behalf, with as much forbearance and compassion as we can, state their final case. If we don't do it, they're lost in the mists and veils of time. The more I think about that, the more not to harp on it, but I feel that is some sort of primal writerly responsibility. Now, I'm sure writing had a very utilitarian purpose initially. The Sumerians would mark, grain and crop quantities of, capitalism, proto-capitalism reared its ugly head very early, I'm sure. They were just making marks to denote quantities and transactions. I'm sure there was a utilitarian side, which is maybe a bookkeeper and not a writer. It's a good, interesting idea. But I'm back to the commemoration. It's holding off time. It's denying time. And time wins, and will win for all of us in the end, in the very end. But we can forestall. Maybe it's a power trip for a writer. We can forestall time for those that were in our circle that we can speak to, and state their final case.
So it's sort of for you then, sort of like battling against the Ozymandias effect. Just sort of trying to keep it.
Yeah, Ozymandias, exactly. That the idea. Here was this. It's very poignant. I mean, here's this once great civilization, and it's disappeared under the sands. I wrote a satire sonnet on Ozymandias that was picked up by Chris Dickey of Newsweek. I think he put it on a few years ago. James Dickey was his dad, the great poet, the great Southern poet who wrote Deliverance. That's an interesting little side story. But I think we have a responsibility. We're not just doodling.
Okay.
I think we have a weighty responsibility, and we chronicle the past,
Jeremy,
as much as future.
Okay, Jeremy, let's end with you. What are your thoughts about the origins of essaying and what we've been talking about?
Yeah, easy question there, right? Yeah, I don't know. Like I always like the maybe it was 1960 Hemingway's Nobel Prize speech. I mean, the motivations for a writer are sometimes not even known to a writer, and as Faulkner said, maybe it's just to say Kilroy was here. And I tend to agree with Andrew and Norman about this the sacred task of the writer in terms of to commemorate, to remember, to be a voice for those that are either A, voiceless politically, or B, going to be voiceless just through the onslaught of time. And having sort of written out of several different motivations, but the primary one trying to be to remember or to recast someone who I loved and someone who was close to me. That's what art is for. And maybe to kind of circle us all back to where we were in talking about Nietzsche and as a motivation is that this is so very finite and over so quickly. And then the sun goes the way of all medium red giant stars that exist, and in 5 billion years we'll all be gone. But in the interim, we have a chance to create something beautiful and something meaningful.
Okay, we'll end this segment on that note, and in our final segment, we'll have the three fellows talk about their futures, the futures of essays, and give them each a closing remark, and we'll do that coming up. All right, I think it's been a productive conversation with our three essayists, Norman Ball, Jeremy Collins, and Andrew Grossman. So let's wrap up this final segment. Let's just talk a little bit about the future and give you guys a closing remark. Andrew, where do you see yourself both as a writer and an essayist in 5 or 10 years? And do you have any ideas or comments about the art of essay writing, and any closing remarks?
Well, 5 or 10 years, well, I'm not really sure. As I was suggesting before, I often do try to think about how I can write in a more intimate way. As someone who often writes, say, cultural criticism or film criticism, I'm writing in a form that often keeps intimacy at bay. I should probably try to branch out and get out of my comfort zone. Perhaps this essay I mentioned earlier about my old professor who died recently, maybe that might provide an avenue for greater intimacy. As far as the future of essays in general goes, I think Norm mentioned this before. I think, to the degree that more and more stuff that we might publish is published electronically on the internet, technology poses certain dangers. Norman was talking before about short attention spans and so forth, but I think that even becomes less abstracted and more concrete and visual, to the degree that so many online publications are physically reducing the size of paragraphs, which is a terrible imposition and really violence to the style of the writer. I know I publish certain things, and then when I see it online, all of my paragraphs are suddenly broken up such that each sentence has its own line breaks, and each sentence basically forms its own paragraph. And I think this is a terrible paradox. Somehow online it's supposed to be quote easier, or whatever that means, but I think it's nearly impossible to read.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
It's fractured to the point where, as much as I might like fractured writing, it's fractured to an irrational and illegible point, which totally, it destroys the very organic nature of what you've written, and I think that's a serious problem.
Yeah, my pet peeve is so-called editors that don't know the goddamn difference between a complex and a run-on sentence. If you have 3 or 4 clauses, they'll think that's a run-on. No, run-on sentences. Andy met Joe. Andy met Joe, and Joe and Bill ran up the hill, and then it's Andy and Joe. Bill ran up the hill, and that's a run-on sentence. But anyway. Any final? Was that your final comment then, Andrew?
For now,
Okay.
Final comment.
How about you, Jeremy?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a fractured, interesting, invigorating world that we live in. I mean, look what the internet's done. It's brought us all together this morning, and we get to talk about these things and be connected. There's an interesting piece done last week in the New York Times by J. Caspian King, who chronicles the way in which Black Lives Matter, and from Ferguson to what's going on in Baltimore right now, and the ways in which these bloggers and from social media and Twitter are able to connect and form a movement. I know there's been a lot done by Malcolm Gladwell and by Nicholas Carr in his book The Shallows that sort of question the way in which such commitments are often very thin. But in another context, it's something that's very exciting and very real, that what the internet's able to do. Like Andrew, I'm all for greater complexity, larger paragraphs, moments of rumination. And you know, I think we have my wife and I, we have a 6-month-old, and I often reading on an iPad or a phone from the long form app, and I find on those essays, I mean, I'm reading 5,000 word essays, often under the covers with the dim light on the digital pad, but it's a similar effect. So I'm somewhere in between. Either we're in dark days or light days. I don't know, but they're pretty exciting. And in terms of where the essay is going, I think a multiplicity of voices is always a good thing.
Okay, well, Norm, I'll give you the final say for our essayists, so go ahead.
Well, I think there's a tendency to, it's a generational thing, to darken the days and to bemoan, the upcoming generation. I mean, I think that's probably a sign of old age. But having said that, I think that the age is getting darker. So I'm going to be stereotypical. But I recall there's a great Umberto Eco essay where he talks about, we tend to, flagellate ourselves and our incoherency and our illiteracy. If you go back 500 years, the symbolic vocabulary of the average human being was about, they had a vocabulary about 5 images. It was the cross, or the sickle, or what, I don't know. There were it was obviously religious iconography, but they were profoundly illiterate, and so to bemoan the current age is to forget from whence we originated just a few short centuries ago. Now, I think essays are probably they're going to become more multimedia. I think there's going to be, as we're doing here, there's going to be visual components, there's going to be audio. Why not? I mean, the bits and bytes, the electrons don't care. So I think you're going to see a migration of essays off the written page, and you're going to see video essays. We're going to avail all the media genres that we have available to us. I think that's probably the trend. I'm also a little bit suspicious of beating up the audience. I mean, I do it. We all do it, especially essayists. We're always berating the audience because there's a tendency for writers to bemoan the shortage of elevated readers. That's a very common thing. And I think writers have to bear, some of that blame. If you're not attracting an audience, the product has to have something to do with it. It can't just be all the dumb people out there.
Yeah. I know. I totally agree. I think, and I know Jeremy is in a writing program, but I think the mass marketing, the post World War II MFA mill kind of mindset where you can sort of just mass produce writers has done incalculable damage. My dad, who was born in 1916, was functionally illiterate. Most of the people of his generation were functionally illiterate. There is virtually no illiteracy now. I mean, there might be 1%, but I coined a term years ago called deliteracy, where people choose not to read quality stuff. I did a show a couple of months ago on Watchmen, the comic book, and it might be a good comic book, but it's not goddamn literature. It just isn't. It deals with minor childish tropes, and it cliched and whatnot. But anyway, I'm not going to rant anymore. I think it was an excellent show. I thank all 3 of you for being on here. As I mentioned, next week I will be interviewing the wife of an actor friend of mine that died recently, and 2 weeks from now I'll be talking the first of 3 shows on the nature of existence with a physicist, a philosopher, and the first show is going to be with a theologian, a retired Episcopalian bishop. So I hope people will join in to watch that too. So again, thank you to Norman Ball, Jeremy Collins, and Andrew Grossman. And I think and hope that there'll be more shows like this where people will talk about essays and will talk about writing in a way that isn't just, dumbed down. So again, thanks all 3 of you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, guys.